Hi, I'm Auntie Dawn. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm making chicken stock. Chicken stock, sometimes called bone broth, is a fabulous ingredient. It's rich and adds a whole lot of body to gravy or soup, but in the store it can be pretty expensive and it can come in some pretty questionable packaging. So I like to make my own in the pressure cooker. So my process starts when I get the chicken home from the store. This is 3 pounds of chicken thighs. So my first step is to remove the skin. Oh, these are some nice big ones. Frequently, the butcher shop gives me a mix, and there's some small ones and some big ones. So just when I roast them, I need to remember to put the smaller ones toward the middle of the baking tray. For a long time, I roasted my chicken with the skin on, but then I discovered that since I don't eat the skin, I was just throwing away the roasted part. All right, now that I've washed my hands thoroughly, I'm going to put a good sprinkle of salt over all of the chicken and the skin. All right, now I'm going to turn it over, do the other side. Okay, now I'm going to work the salt in, making sure it gets on all of the various parts of the thighs and well into these skins. Now I'm going to bundle them all up together. Wash my hands again. All right, now I'm going to wrap these up. Now that I've put them on a plate, I'm going to put them in the fridge where they'll stay for about a day. So one thing about salt curing the chicken before you cook it is that if you let it go for more than a couple of days, it can start to get a sort of cured texture that's a little bit rubbery to my taste, and I don't much like it. Now the chicken's been sitting in the salt for a day, so I can unwrap it, and you can see all the salt is absorbed, and so this is ready to go in the roasting pan. So I'm going to start up my ventilation, heat the oven to 400 degrees. While the oven comes up to temperature, I'll get the chicken laid out on the roasting pan. So since most of these are big pieces, I want to lay all of the big ones around the outside edge where they'll cook a little faster, and then save the middle for the smaller ones. I want there to be enough room around them that none of them are touching each other. That way the air will circulate better, all that hot air in the oven, and make them roast better. So with the skins, I'm going to take a baking dish and lay out these chicken skins. They're going to be a key component of the stock, and I want them to get nice and roasty. As you can see, they're all laid out. They are going to shrink a lot as they roast, so they will get a chance to cook without touching each other. Now that the oven's come up to temperature, I will put both in, the chicken on top, skins on the rack beneath it. It's a good idea for the skins to have the protection of the chicken on top because they're so thin that they can cook very quickly. Okay, about 15 minutes later, and the skins are done. You can see that the fat is all drained away, and they've shrunk up considerably and gotten fairly crispy. They are also all stuck to the bottom of the pan, so it actually makes it really easy to drain the fat off. You can see I'm inverting it and the skins are still stuck on. Now this is what they call schmaltz in Yiddish, pure clarified chicken fat. It's really excellent for a variety of uses. Label it, stick it in the fridge. The next step is to remove these chicken skins from the pan. So I'm going to use a little spatula and just scrape them up. I used to roast them on a baking sheet and they would get really, really crispy, but when they're that crispy, they're almost irresistible, so they don't end up in the stock pot. So I'm going to put these in the container so that they can cool, and here they are. Now I'm going to grab a pair of kitchen shears and cut them up. I find it's really important when you're making stocks that the water can get to everything, and if those chicken skins are in a big sheet like they come, then the water doesn't really seem to do a very good job of extracting the collagen and other proteins from them. So I'm going to snip, snip, snip. Lots of little pieces. Okay, now the chicken is done. You can see there's little outlines of brown around each one, and the outer bits of the flesh are browned as well. I know a lot of people would consider this to be a little bit overcooked, but it's just how I like it. So these are also stuck to the pan, and I can use that to help break them up while they're still hot. So I'm going to take my little spatula and cut on either side of the bone. This helps expose more of it to the air, and so it will cool off much more quickly. This is, of course, after I've given it a moment to rest. I'm using the chicken juices to help get all of the brown bits up off the pan, because I'm going to want all those to go into the stock. And you can probably hear Lily complaining that I'm not paying attention to her. Hers is a sad life. Now I'm going to let these cool until they're safe enough to handle. Now the chicken is cooled, so I can start to remove it. I'm going to build it into a solid as block as possible inside the storage container, because the less air there is, the less chance there is for something to get in there and grow. So now that I've gotten basically each wing off of it, I can get in there with my hands and start removing the rest of it and piling it on top. I'm a little more careful in the deeper levels of the chicken storage, just because I know that's the last of it I'm going to get to, so it'll have more of a chance to go bad. So if there's anything still clinging to my hands after a good washing, I just won't have a chance to inoculate it. And so as I get all of the meat off of each one, I'm going to put it into the container with the skin bits. I know a lot of people like to make stock with the whole like wings. I don't quite like either the flavor or the waste. I feel it gives the finished stock too heavy a flavor, too much like overcooked meat. And also that's meat that we don't get to eat, and it's a hell of a thing for an animal to die and us carnivores not even be able to eat it. Okay, so now I've got one container that's full of meat and one container that's full of skin and bones for stock. Scrape up the juices left on the bottom of the baking sheet. And if I was going to be making a soup or something with the meat, I might put it on there, but since I know I'm going to want this all in the stock, I'm going to just scrape it in with the skin and bone. All right, now we can actually start the stock. So here I've got the other way. If you want to make chicken stock but you don't need a bunch of meat, I have chicken frames that are roasted. So I'm going to break them up. You want to expose as much of that tissue as possible. So the frames are what are left of a chicken carcass after the butcher has broken out all of the parts that you usually see for sale, like the wings and the breast and the thighs and the drumstick. And this is mostly the vertebrae that are left over, and there's lots of connective tissue and little bits of meat, so it makes a really nice base for a stock. Since there is fat that's already congealed, and I know I'm not going to want to keep that, I'm going to discard it. I'm going to add all of this liquid that came off the chicken while it was roasted, and then I will add water, first from the container, so I pick up everything that was left over, and then straight from the faucet. And I want to put just enough water in to cover up all of the chicken parts. Now I will put it into the cooker. Put the lid on. And now I will put it on a 4-hour cook cycle. That is the more setting on my unit under the soup broth. Okay, so now the 4-hour cycle is done. You can see the valve has released. So I'm going to open it up. Press cancel, and then hit saute. Okay, now that half-hour saute cycle is done. And when we look into the pot, we can see that there's this kind of crinkly substance here. This is some of the protein that comes from the chicken. In a lot of traditional stock recipes, they'll tell you to skim it constantly while it's cooking, and that is to remove this. But I would burn myself way too much doing that, and it's way too much time sitting over the pot. So I've discovered that if I just strain it all and let all of the fat and everything congeal at the top and scoop it off, it won't show up in any of my stock or the finished dishes I make with it. So you can see that all of the ends of the bones, all of the cartilage, and everything is dissolved. All of that is now in the stock rather than just sitting on the bone and needing to be composted when I'm done. So I have an 8-cup Pyrex here with a fine strainer on it and a slotted spoon. I'm going to remove all of the bones and as much of the skin as I can. Okay, so you can see that now all of the stock that's still clinging to the bones is able to drip off. I'm going to let this drip for a few minutes. All right, now I'm going to pour the stock. There we go. You can see I've chosen a vessel large enough that all of the stock can go in without the strainer touching the bottom. That's important because if there's any contact between the stock and what's in the strainer, it will just wick up and never drain out that last little bit. Now I pour the stock into my storage container. I like mason jars. All right, now I'm gonna put the lids on. Okay, now that the lids are on, I can label them. And I will label them chicken stock reduction and with the month and year. I'm going to set them on the countertop to cool because they add a lot of heat to the refrigerator if I put them straight in. I've got a pretty nifty trick for getting these hot jars cool quickly. I take an ice pack from the freezer and just put it between them, and it helps suck the warmth right out of them. Now that my jar of stock is chilled in the fridge, it has become nice and solid, and you can see the fat and some of the proteins are there on top. So I will spoon that off, and as you can see, there's a kind of layer to it. Right on top is that crinkly stuff that we did not scoop off earlier. And so we want to make sure we get all of that. If you're lucky, it'll come off in a nice clean layer. Sometimes I really have to scrape it, get it off, and it wastes some of the stock, but it's better to get it as clean as I can. So, and that's what that looks like. If you melt it and put it back in the fridge, it gets a nice solid thing like this. See how it jiggles? And I can sometimes invert it so that it, as they say with milkshakes, it passes the inversion test. This stuff seems more like ballistics gel than it does like food, but it does a great job of thickening up gravies and soups. If I'm leaving the stock in the refrigerator, I tend to leave the fat on top because it seems like it helps preserve it a little, but I always take it off before I put it in the freezer. And this is why. As you can see, the middle of the stock has risen up. Sometimes it does in a very jagged manner, and that ends up mixing the fat in with the stock. It makes it very difficult to extract. So before you freeze, one, make sure you leave plenty of empty space, sometimes called headroom, at the top of the jar, and remove all of that layer of fat. So the few times I did not leave enough headspace at the top of the jar, that finger in the middle of the stock pushed up and pushed down at the bottom of the jar and actually broke the bottom of the jar out. So I really recommend leaving plenty of space for expansion before you freeze a jar of stock. When trash day comes, I will compost this fat with a light heart, knowing that I have saved the nice rendered chicken fat from roasting that skin, which has got less water in it and the other proteins, and so it makes a much better cooking fat. It makes me happy to get another use out of the chicken I buy. Raising animals for meat is expensive in just about every way, and so using every bit really helps justify that expense. I use this stock in so many ways. It makes an excellent base for a soup or a gravy, and a few spoonfuls absolutely transforms a sauté. I hope you enjoyed this stock as much as I do. See you next time.